Hello, friends. So thank you so much for supporting all things green. So I say this to those of you supporting the Hamilton College Arboretum and to those of you with the Clinton Garden Club. Thank you so much for your time. So keep up all of the good efforts, do the right thing for your soil, and be proud of your plants. Thank you.
To welcome everybody to our very first virtual Arboretum presentation. I think this will be the first of a few. Let's hope it's a few before we can get back to live face-to-face Arboretum events. I'd like to introduce Dr. Beth Brantley. Dr. Brantley is a technical support specialist for Bartlett Tree Experts. I've seen her speak before. I think you will find her discussion today informative and entertaining. Beth is certainly entertaining. She's a bundle of energy, and I've always enjoyed speaking with Beth. The talk today is about tiny creatures. It's going to be about the little things in the garden that we may not always pay particular attention to. Some of them we should. Some of them we can kind of forget about. At the end, we're going to do, you can type in the text in the bottom of the screen, you can type in questions, but we're going to answer all questions at the end of the conversation. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Beth Brantley, and welcome Beth to Hamilton College virtually.
Hey, thanks, Don. So good morning, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be with you today. I was really excited to get the opportunity to visit Hamilton College and to tour the Arboretum and with Don, so like super cool. And I'm going to talk about little things, and I'm going to do this in the format of a PowerPoint today. So I'm about to share my screen. If at any time you have problems hearing me or if something goes wonky, just let me know. So I would ask Sharon if you can just help me with that, and we'll do the chat comments at the end, just like Don said. So, okay, it is time now to talk about little things. And I think I would like to give a disclaimer. It's going to load here in just a second. A little disclaimer that this is not a slideshow that I have given previously. It's not a topic that I've covered in this way, and I chose it because I didn't really care. And I think one of the important things in life is to develop passion about as much as you can. And I thought, well, the only way to develop passion is to learn about it and then to share it with someone else, and that's why I'm here with you today. So I wanted to be sure that my talk actually meets the mission of your Arboretum, so I included the mission statement here and the elements of your mission that I feel my talk will address. And that's just providing some education and really helping you understand a little bit more about the small creatures and taking care of them on our landscapes. So it's really a question of what we don't see. And we all certainly see the squirrels, and it's that time of year when what I'm going to call our charismatic megafauna. So I think of squirrels, the happy things people enjoy seeing. We could include the birds, we could include pandas, that's everybody's sort of favorite charismatic megafauna. But there are small things on the landscape that we need to be thinking about. And that's what we are doing today. So thinking about what we might be missing. This is just an outline of this presentation. I'll provide an introduction to arthropods, talk a little bit about soils, humus and mulch, and then I'll just go through these organisms in order. I think it's hard, particularly for many of us, to appreciate ticks, and I will give you perhaps one reason why ticks matter at the end of the little tick section. And then I'll talk about mites, and there's so much diversity in the mite world. And I'll just cover briefly a few of those really cool things that mites do and roles that they play. And I'll discuss the roles of arthropods in soil. So that's the shredders, the predators, herbivores, and fungivores. So creatures that are out there that you may or may not be familiar with. And so this is why the charismatic mesofauna matter. So I've already said megafauna, but mesofauna getting a little bit smaller, and then I would go to microfauna if we went even smaller than that. I will not talk about nematodes today. They don't fit in the picture as arthropods. More on that too in a moment. So all of these organisms really matter because we just live in one big giant food web, and that food web also exists in the soil. I'm interested in these arthropods because of roles that they play in decomposition, in decompaction of our soils, and again as shredders, so breaking up organic matter into smaller pieces. So for some of you, this might be a review. For some of you, you might not have thought about arthropods for a very long time, but the arthropods all have jointed appendages. They all have exoskeletons, which must be shed in the process of molting as they grow larger. And then they all have bilateral symmetry, so both sides are the same. And there are 5 major categories of arthropods that are listed there for you. So the arachnids, centipedes, and millipedes in their own classes, insects, crustaceans, and then horseshoe crabs, which I won't speak on today, but they're just so super fascinating. And I'd encourage all of you to learn more about arthropods on your own. So the arachnids, 2 body regions. I won't go into this detail for all of these different groups of arthropods, but I did just want to say a few exciting things about these. So ticks and mites are the organisms I will speak about today, but we could, as it gets closer to Halloween, have a really cool discussion about spiders. And that's what most of us think of when we think about organisms that just have 2 body regions and 8 legs. And then the centipedes and the millipedes. Again, most of us just sort of overlook these and don't think about the roles that they have in our ecosystems, and particularly in the building of soils. So more on each of these independently in just a little bit, but the quick take home, so centipedes, just that 1 pair of legs per segment, and millipedes having 2. And then that modification into fangs for centipedes. And millipedes, well, they're just, they're just vegetarians, so most of them. And they're just eating plant material, so they don't need to have fangs as the centipedes do. Probably, well, for most of us, the most exciting group within the arthropods, of course, are the insects. And there's so much diversity, and they're just so terribly exciting. And I wanted to share a really good reference book with you. If you're not familiar with this Kaufman Field Guide, I'd strongly encourage you to get this. It's a really good field book, and I've actually read it like a book from cover to cover. And there are funny little quips and anecdotes in it. So pick one up if you don't already have it. And again, that's really my go-to. And it is North America, so they are very particular in talking about where you're going to find the specific insects, but it's also got a pretty cool section at the front end for arthropods that are not insects. So that's just my book of the day, my helpful tip. And then such diversity within the insects. Crustaceans, I will speak about one, and most of us know this is a roly-poly. And as children, perhaps you played with these, or maybe as adults, I still play with them. But maybe you didn't know that they're actually more closely related to shrimp than they are to a centipede or to any other arthropod that looks similar to that. And then I thought this was just kind of classic, a good little cartoon for our morning. And I don't know if any of you have spent much time with insects, but I have. And sometimes when I sit down to a lobster or a crab meal, I have to pause for a moment and think about what it is exactly that I'm eating and not make that reference too closely to something like a cockroach. So, such great diversity of living organisms. And again, thinking about what we walk on when we're walking across the Arboretum, what we're working with perhaps every day in our gardens, if you're a gardener, and really realizing the benefit of these arthropods. So there's a lot of information on this slide. And I will cover some of this a little bit later. But I would encourage you to go back at a later time and review this if you want, or you can just Google this. One thing I will tell you is that each of these images in my actual PowerPoint has a reference, so I'm not providing you with those proper URL references for citations. But if you're interested in them, I can absolutely share the PowerPoint or just share the citations with you at a later time. So why, again, these all matter? It's all about the soil. It's all about this food web that we have. So what's in our soil? Well, a lot. And I just thought this was a nice picture of that crazy plant that you have in your arboretum, which I had never seen before. So that was just like the highlight of my tour of the arboretum, and I just couldn't get away from it, and you'll see this plant again in a few slides. But I always think about the soil that the plants are growing in, and is the soil as rich and nutritious and full of organic matter as it can be for the plant that's growing in it? And I just happened to say organic matter on that last slide, which brings me to that point that we do have soils. There are soils in New York State, in fact, your bogs, that are primarily organic matter, and they have not developed from typical minerals, bedrock, that we tend to see elsewhere. So soil can just be so different across our landscapes. It can be different even across your yard, and that's really interesting from my perspective. I am a plant pathologist, and I apologize for not telling you that. But I'm also a forester, and I'm also an arborist, and I'm also a lover of all things green, so that includes plants. But I'm really interested in soils, and when I look at a tree, that's the first thing I'm thinking about, is what's happening underground. Is the soil as healthy as it can be? So parts of the soil, so the pore spaces are filled with air and water, and in this pretty simplistic diagram, you've got an idea of the percentages. When soil gets compacted, this occurs all the time on a landscape, particularly on a college campus where people are walking and creating their own pathways instead of using sidewalks, which drives me crazy, but that's what people do. They compact the soil and they reduce that pore space. In the process of doing this, they reduce that opportunity for organisms to move in and through as well. So what is humus? Well, humus is not hummus. And I always like to say that because I spent a lot of my life working with 18 to 20-year-olds, and there were quite often many misunderstandings. And that was the only thing they had perhaps ever heard of was hummus, and they thought it was the same thing. But humus is just that decomposition, that breakdown of that naturally occurring organic matter. So we think of that with leaf litter, with anything that's falling out of trees right now. And that's developing this organic layer that organisms can feed on and in and help to create soil. And so speaking of organic matter, thinking about mulch, one of the most exciting things for me visiting Hamilton College was seeing that there were amazing mulch rings under so many of the large trees. So that made me just incredibly happy, because in the forest, as you know, most trees, they're not growing with turf up to the trunk. So I also included this picture of a tree on the Hamilton campus that was just loaded with bur oak acorn caps. And I thought again to myself, well, the squirrels are quite happy here, and I'm sure that people are enjoying watching those, but they do function almost as a mulch layer. So mulch should be organic matter. Some people use rocks as mulch, some people use plastic mulch, but I would strongly encourage everyone to use naturally occurring organic matter. So shredded leaves, bark, shredded bark and wood is ideal. And I can answer any questions that you might have about mulch at the end of this as well. I'm very much a proponent of mulch. So why does organic matter actually matter to us? Well, again, not just for providing food for all of the organisms that are shown here, but absolutely for the formation and creation of soil. And the breakdown of organic matter provides nutrients, not just for all of these organisms, but for the plants that live in soil. So again, just so much to think about and so much that perhaps we overlook on a daily basis. I'm about to give you a little video. So Charlie, I know that you're an artist, right? So just nod for me. Okay, so I am not an artist. I'm very artistically challenged. So for me, claymation is really exciting because I like to think that I can make clay snakes and that maybe someday I could create my own claymation video, but I'm not to that point yet. So instead, we're going to get a little cool claymation video that I just thought was super, that's from Cornell.
The soil food web begins just like that of the world above, with plants. A leaf falling to the ground may not seem a big or important event, but it provides food for an astonishing array of microscopic life. Bacterial cells and fungal hyphae break down the leaf and absorb nutrients, yet these are only the first to take advantage. Tiny nematode worms come to graze on the growing microbes, while a pair of springtails samples the fungus. Springtails are six-legged animals with diverse appearances. They love fungus, but will not pass up a nutritious nematode. Meanwhile, an aurabatid mite has just arrived. It feeds on the dead leaf and on the bacteria covering it like jam. When a predatory mesostigmatid mite appears, the springtails flee for the surface, but the nematodes are not so quick, and the mite drinks them dry. On the soil surface, other predators await. A dipleuron strikes, and the springtail reveals how it got its name. A lever-like appendage on its abdomen allows the springtail to jump up to 6 inches to escape danger. Yet with its 6 quick legs and sensitive antennae, the dipleuron is a tenacious hunter, which can now claim its meal. These are just a few of the many creatures that call the soil home, living their millions of little lives right beneath our feet.
So now you've just learned something about me. What you've learned is that I'm easily entertained, right? So, so it's actually a nice little segue into arachnophobia. And again, as we approach Halloween, so it's just a little over a month away. It's the time of scary spiders. And I always like to think about why we're so fearful of spiders and all things arachnid. And then I think about, well, all the scary spiders in our literature and in our movies. So we've been trained to be afraid. But then we also have some happy spiders in our media, in our books. So we've got Spider-Man, we've got Charlotte's Web, so Charlotte the Spider. But I think it's just this idea of creepy crawly, things that have too many legs or no legs, and it's really a lot of just conditional training. So the most exciting thing that people can do is just share passion as they encounter these things. And I do want to share a quick personal story with you. I travel a lot in my job. And that means I spend a lot of time in hotels, 21 nights in hotels in the month of February. And then COVID in March left me at home for 60 days. So what happens when you stay at home for 60 days? Well, of course, you go when you get a COVID canine. So now my husband and I are the proud owners of a 5-year-old deaf beagle mix. And she's, of course, the love of our lives. But I'm back on the road now, and I'm back into hotels. So why I'm sharing fear, loathing, and disgust with you is at one of my more recent hotel stays in New York, I found bed bugs. And that was so cool. I had never seen a bed bug before. So I had little insect files and I collected them and I took them to the front desk, and they just weren't as excited as I was to find a bed bug. So a lesson learned, not everyone is passionate about all things that are creepy and scary, but I did get many thousand Hilton honors points for that find of my bed bugs. And I still like the hotel and I will go back, but I haven't been back since. So I think that this picture of a spider is absolutely gorgeous, and maybe we're just not looking at these creepy crawly things the right way. So ticks and mites. Again, I think we need to know a little bit more about these in order to understand them. And this is just this one particular group of organisms. And I'm going to talk quickly about ticks just because we're about to enter an important tick season. So there's lots of information on this. Probably the most important thing is that ticks and mites at the very bottom bullet can be not only population control agents as parasites, but they can also be beneficial. So just a quick little tick talk. And you have lots and lots of good references and resources within New York and elsewhere, of course, but particularly with the 4 big ticks that we're worried about. And again, our fear of ticks, I feel, is justified with ticks as vectors of human pathogens, so carrying disease. We do have every right not to like ticks. And if we think about the impact of ticks on other populations, so birds get ticks, all organisms get ticks, but in particular, the winter tick on moose has really changed the moose population. And just another example of our changing climate and what's happening across our planet. So most of us are thinking, again, of ticks as bad, and rightly so. Just a quick overview. If you're not familiar with tick identification, it's always good to become more familiar with ticks. And perhaps you don't know about the Asian longhorn tick. Now that one in particular is not so fond of humans as a source of a blood meal, and that's important to know as well. They have other hosts that they prefer, other mammalian hosts. For example, they were first found on sheep. So just another tick to know. And then perhaps if you enjoy eating red meat, you are familiar with Lone Star tick and the fact that it does something slightly different. It can actually ingest a protein that may, if you're sensitive, may make you sensitive and develop an allergic response to red meat. So that's called the alpha-gal syndrome, and that's associated with the Lone Star tick. That doesn't have to be embedded in you. That's just a bite. But again, not everyone is going to have the same response with that for the allergy. So the common 4, I included the Asian longhorn tick in that picture. And then I also mentioned the woodchuck tick, which is primarily, its primary host, of course, is the groundhog or the woodchuck. So we're not so worried about that. That's actually kind of a larger tick and one that's not commonly seen. But as we approach October, we are about to see adult deer ticks back on the scene. So what are ticks going to do and how are we going to get them? We're going to find them this way. We're going to find them as they're searching for a blood meal. We're going to find them at about knee height in tall grasses and short shrubs. So just a little bit keeping ticks on our radar right now in this time of year. And so here's the picture that I wanted to show you about deer ticks, where we're going to find them, what they're doing right now. So this is a 2-year, 3-host cycle. But on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see what's about to come. So adults looking for another blood meal. And I would prefer to be out in the woods in autumn, but I have to be vigilant, and I hope that you are as well. There are absolutely ways that you can manage the landscape. And if you're not familiar with this, take the time to really study and how you can create, really it's a barrier for ticks. So they tend not to go so far, especially the deer ticks. So they don't move very far across your landscape. They just tend to kind of hang out, climb up when it's hungry time, when conditions are right, and wave their front legs around, and that's called questing. So really good information here about how you can manage to reduce tick populations on your personal property. But this is the benefit of ticks, I think, is that they are part of the food web. This is just but one. Opossums are really fantastic creatures, and if you haven't thought about these lately either, I would encourage you to do so. So the role that ticks actually play in our ecosystem is that of a parasite. So they actually help keep host populations in check. But here again, they're part of that food web, in particular for opossums. Other things eat them as well. But this is just sort of the poster child for tick predators. So moving on from ticks and speaking about mites. So again, closely related organisms, but why I like them is because they're just so versatile and they do so many things. And I'm going to talk about good mites and bad mites, but my bulleted list is really simply in reference to mites that are living in the soil, why they're so critically important for us. If you've never had chiggers, well, I would call yourself lucky. And I would tell you that if you continue to take time in the woods or spend time in these little interface areas where grasses transition to brushy areas, to woody areas, and as our temperatures keep increasing over time, you will likely be exposed to and experience chiggers. And I grew up in the South. That is not my torso, but there were many times that my torso looked like that, as did my sock regions and other parts of my body. But these are little mites, little red mites that actually, they don't burrow into your skin. They just simply put their mouth parts into your skin, and then they ingest a solution to which you have an allergic reaction. And they're quite itchy. So that was my human example. I could have talked about Demodex mites. I mean, there are all sorts of mites all over and associated with humans. But because this is an exciting group affiliated with an arboretum, with the Hamilton College Arboretum, I should speak about mites that are more relevant. And so spider mites, this is a real problem if you garden perhaps. And mites are here to do their thing. They have a place on this planet as well, but that level of infestation is not what I want to see on my plant. So these are not beneficial. But there are beneficial mites that we can use to control the bad mites. So if I'm working with clients and I work for Bartlett Tree Experts, if I'm working with clients and if they would prefer to take a softer approach and a more natural, I'm not going to say more natural approach, but a biological control approach, although it is natural, to control mite populations, well, there are these really super cool predaceous mites, and you can order these from companies that actually produce them, and you shake them out onto the infested plants and they just go to town. So I don't have a good video for you, but there are plenty on the internet. So I'm a firm believer in using predaceous mites to control mite populations in my garden and on the landscape. But what really matters to me are the mites that are present in soil. And so if you think about how many mites there are in just a little bit of soil, and I'm going to give you a little tip at the end of this presentation on how you can have fun with your soil and look at mites, especially if you have a microscope. But again, it's this unseen world that we walk on or walk over every day. And they're just so critically important for creating the soil that feeds our planet. So moving from mites, so we've talked about ticks, we've talked about mites, and now we need to talk about the role of arthropods, and I've just chosen a couple that are so important with our soil formation process. And I thought, oh my gosh, I have to take advantage of this. So shredders are going to be my first group, and there's a pair of Felcos in the very center of the screen, and most of us don't spend our time shredding things with Felcos, but we certainly could. This group of organisms that we call shredders are really just chewing and making plant pieces smaller. And that increases surface area, which is important because it enables other organisms to come in and to break those parts down, again, recycling nutrients back into the environment. So this group of shredders, I'm going to talk about a few examples. So I'd like to start with the example of millipedes. And I suspect that most of you have encountered a millipede and you've played with it and then it excreted a stinky substance and then you dropped it. And perhaps you shared that with friends, or maybe you didn't. But most of us have this relationship with arthropods as kind of negative. But these are very important. Perhaps you don't like them inside your house, and I'll get to that in just a moment with a different related species. But there are so many millipedes, and they are so beneficial on our landscape, again, from that decomposition, that shredding purpose that they serve. So millipedes, and then another group, so the isopods, these are our terrestrial crustaceans. I promised you with that picture of lobsters and crabs that there would be one that we need to think about, and that's the pill bugs and the sow bugs, which we often call wood lice or the wood louse. So I care about them because they are helping us break stuff down in the role of shredders. There are many other arthropods that function as shredders, but these were just the three I wanted to think about today: the millipedes, the sow bugs, and the pill bugs. When they roll up, when roly-polies do their thing, they look a little bit like an armadillo, and they actually have this kind of crazy genus name. So it's Armadillodillium for the pill bugs. So get that, armadillo, Armadillodillium. And you know what? They're here. They're on the campus. They're in the arboretum. They're in your garden. They're all across the planet. So that was a little on shredders. But then we also have predators, and there's so many of them. I'm not going to talk about the mantids today, and I'm not going to talk about spiders either. But again, the predators are serving that function of really keeping populations in check, and also to provide more exciting organic matter as we build soil. And that is really creepy. I will say, the spider that's feeding on the minnow. So why people are afraid of spiders. But the centipedes. So centipedes are predaceous. And so there are lots of centipedes. Again, we encounter these outside, but then with the millipedes, I said I'd bring it back to the inside question. And this is a quote from my husband just this morning. So he saw this slide. He said, "Oh, is that one of those house centipedes?" I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "Yeah, one of the creepiest creatures on the planet." And in fact, my husband goes into stealth mode in the basement many nights, and his goal is to kill the house centipedes. I don't mind them. I know what they're doing. They're feeding on other creatures that are in our house. So, you know, Sharon, you mentioned an 1850s house. I'm sure it's not very tight, and I expect you have lots of things in your basement and perhaps in other rooms in your house. And the house centipede is really fast, if you're familiar with these, and they do kind of creep people out. But they definitely have a role in our ecosystems, so maybe not so much in our houses. But we also have predatory mites. And again, I keep circling back around to the mites because they are mighty, the mighty mites, and there's just so much diversity. But the fact that they feed on other mites on our landscape and in soil is particularly important. And I know there are mites. I know there are mites in these trees. I know there are mites in the turf. I know there are mites in the soil in this picture. I also know there are other predators in this picture. So another group of arthropods that interests me are the plant feeders. And this picture of the C-shaped grubs should remind everybody of the larval form of Japanese beetles. And they are in fact root feeders. The problem is if they are feeding on turf roots, then you get patches in turf, dead patches, and most people don't like to have that in their landscape. So particularly problems with turf-based areas such as golf courses or athletic fields. So people don't like these. They consider these grubs to be a nuisance, and in fact, in that respect, they are. But other plant feeders are typically not such problems. And they're finding roots to feed on. The one that I'd like for everyone to think about is the cicadas. And if you didn't know, they have part of their life stage underground, where they are in fact feeding on plant roots. And no, none of you can read that slide of the little poster of the life cycle of the periodical cicada, and that was certainly not my intent. but I thought that the little image of how they're functioning underground is important for us to be thinking about. So again, just recycling, that's what the plant feeders are doing and helping us build our soil. The mole crickets. So another kind of creepy, you might say, organism. And in this case, because they don't really look like a typical cricket, which I think most people find to be elegant with really long legs, the mole cricket has these short stubby legs and they burrow. So again, they're helping build soil, they're helping sort of restructure soil. So if you just look at those really stocky legs, we often find them feeding on the roots of grasses. And I'm not a true advocate for turf. I find turf to be just kind of a monoculture wasteland, which means that my turf friends and I have to talk about other things like flowers when we get together. But the really cool thing that mole crickets do, and I'd encourage you to Google this later, is the males sing, and they actually construct this burrow. And you can hear their call from hundreds of feet away as a human, and you just may not know you're hearing the call of a mole cricket. They actually create these horns, if you will, and they have 2 different locations where those horns are in their burrows. So just a little bit of some fun fact trivia this morning about mole crickets. I bet we could find some mole crickets on campus if we look in the Arboretum. So we've talked about the plant feeders, but there are also the fungal feeders. And I will say personally, as a plant pathologist, fungi are my favorite, and fungi absolutely rule this planet. If we did not have fungi, we would not be here. So they decompose everything, but they also provide so much food for the little arthropods that we're not thinking about. And the most fun fungal feeder is the springtail. So as you saw in that claymation video, the springtails actually have modified appendages called a furcula, and that enables them to jump. And a lot of people think these are fleas, but they're not fleas at all. So fleas don't have a furcula to begin with, but you can have so many springtails in just a wee bit of soil, so a square meter, more than 10,000. Unfortunately, well, I won't say unfortunately, but like most opportunists, they might find other things to eat, and sometimes springtails, along with everything else that I've mentioned, can be a problem. They can be a pest. So when you Google these, pretty much everything that I've already shown you, one of the first hits you'll get in Google are going to be those of extermination businesses. So Terminex, Orkin, because they are making their living eradicating some of these from our houses. And then in the springtail world, you can also find ways to manage, well, to reduce your springtail populations. But I find them, if you keep your organic matter managed on your landscape, you can have healthy populations of springtails and everything else that I've mentioned. So the Orobatid mites, just another really cool group of organisms that are found in soil and that are feeding on fungal tissue. And a few of these are pests, but I think they're just so lovely and something else we need to be thinking about. So I'd like to encourage all of you to learn more. And there's an entire laboratory dedicated to the arthropods that help build our soil at Cornell. So you can just Google Soil Arthropod Ecology Lab. You can also download the handbook that I've provided on the right side of the screen. And then back over to my left, you can build little plastic cup pitfall traps in your yard, and you can explore all of the living organisms that are present in your soil. So a few little bullet points. So just a take-home message for today. There are excellent references available on the internet. And creatures are very important. I think if we take the time to explore our soils, we're going to see more of what they're actually doing. And it's that function in the food web of all of these small arthropods that we tend not to think about. So the ticks, that was more just a little tick infomercial for us to still be thinking about ticks as we enter the month of October shortly. The role that mites play for all of us, and bed bugs are not mites. I'm sorry that I included my little story in that section. The role of shredders, the role of predators, and then the herbivores and the fungivores. And with that, my friends, I hope at a future time that we can sit in these chairs or visit on the Hamilton College campus in the Arboretum or take a walk together. But for now, this was the best I could do. So I send you my masked greetings from my recent visit to the Hamilton College Arboretum. And I am giving you a thumbs up in front of a really nice tree. And I did take that picture of the empty chairs, the Adirondack style chairs, because I thought that would just be lovely to do someday. And with that, I have said enough.